Hi, and welcome everyone. Welcome to Textile Talks. I am Emma Parker. I'm the Oral History Project Manager at the Quilt Alliance. We're so excited that you've joined us today, and we hope that you'll say where you're joining us from in the chat. It looks like we've got a really global audience today, so that's very exciting. We love seeing where you're connecting from. I'm in hot and humid Durham, North Carolina right now. In case this is the first time you're joining us, Textile Talks is a weekly series presented on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern in partnership with the Quilt Alliance and our partner organizations seen here. All of our Textile Talks are recorded and available via YouTube. We'll put the link to all of our past recordings over the past almost three years now in the chat. Thank you especially to our sponsors who are just credited at the top of the hour, and for donors like you, which make Textile Talks completely free to attend. We'll put the link in the chat now for our donation page. If you'd like to make a donation to Textile Talks, consider doing so, and we thank you in advance for your support. For those of you who don't know the Quilt Alliance specifically, our mission is to document, preserve, and share the story of all quilts and all quilt makers. It's a lofty goal. You can find more about our projects, events, and resources on our website at quiltalliance.org. First, a little bit of housekeeping. You can use the chat box for greetings, comments, and technical help. And if you have questions for our presenters, you can enter them in the Q&A box. They're less likely to get lost there. And we will answer those at the end of the hour or as we can during our presentation, which is live. When you do send a chat, you can select whether you'd like to send it just to panelists speaking or to everyone attending, so your fellow attendees from around the world. So if you'd like to share your message with everyone, just make sure that you've checked that setting before you send. You can also turn on live captions by clicking on the live transcript or CC button on your Zoom controls, or going to your meeting settings in the Zoom app if you're on a phone or tablet. For those of you who don't know about the Quilt Alliance and our work, we're a nonprofit dedicated to documenting, preserving, sharing quilt stories. I just said that. And one of the main ways we've done this is a project called QSOS, or Quilters Save Our Stories. It's an oral history project that's now in its third decade, and we have collected more than 1,200 oral history interviews with quilters about their lives and about their work. Those interviews are archived at the Library of Congress's American Folklife Center and also at the University of Kentucky's Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History. The project started in the 1990s, and many of the interviews were originally recorded on cassette tapes. Each of those interviews were transcribed, and so they could only be experienced as text on a page and not the rich voices of quilters. But thanks to a partnership with the University of Kentucky's Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History, these interviews have been digitized and we can hear quilters' voices for the first time. We decided to put our new digital recordings to good use by starting a brand new podcast, which is called Running Stitch, and is generously sponsored by the Robert and Artist James Foundation. Running Stitch is a podcast hosted by historian and writer Janneken Smucker that interviews fascinating people from across the quilt world and draws on the archive of QSOS interviews. Janneken has a conversation with a contemporary quilter or quilt scholar and plays excerpts from past interviews for podcast guests to respond to. So it really is sort of two conversations at once between Janneken and our guest, and also between the voices of past quilters over the past 3 decades and contemporary quilters today. If you haven't checked out Running Stitch, I definitely suggest you do. We have 3 seasons so far, and you all are some of the first to know that we'll be kicking off a 4th season later this summer that will focus on technology and quilt making, defined broadly, everything from the Industrial Revolution to the rotary cutter, long arm machines, and other advances in quilt making technology and the rise of social media communities. The interview that you're going to hear today will be featured in that season, which is going to be out in the coming months, but you're getting a special sneak peek today. Running Stitch host Janneken Smucker will be interviewing Libs Elliott, who makes beautiful quilts created by computer code, among other things. You're going to hear more about that very soon. I think Libs' work is fascinating and beautiful. I'm very excited about this interview. Just as a quick note, the volume of pre-recorded audio can vary slightly, so we recommend either having your hands ready to adjust volume if you need to, or using captions and grabbing headphones if you have them. We'll also be sharing images during the lecture, so you can select the side-by-side gallery if you want and use the center slider bar to adjust how much of your screen shows the interviewee and the interviewer and the quilts. The settings might be a toggle on mobile. I'm going to introduce Janneken Smucker, our host, and then turn it over to Janneken. Janneken is a former Quilt Alliance board member and president of the board, as well as the host and, quite frankly, the mastermind of Running Stitch. In her spare time, she's also the professor of history at Westchester University, where she specializes in digital and public history and material culture. You may recognize her name as the author of Amish Quilts, Crafting an American Icon. Janneken lectures and writes about quilts for popular and academic audiences. Her next book is A New Deal for Quilts, and it's forthcoming from the International Quilt Museum in association with the University of Nebraska Press in October, where will also be an exhibition at the International Quilt Museum opening this fall. So if you live near Lincoln, Nebraska, or have been wanting to make a pilgrimage to the fantastic International Quilt Museum, I might suggest doing it between October 6, 2023 and April 20th, 2024. I'll turn it over to you, Janneken. Thanks so much.
Hi, thank you so much, Emma. And it's really wonderful to see all your names popping up on my screen. It's lovely to be joining you again for a Textile Talk. Always an enjoyable experience. And I want to thank all of the partnering organizations who have kept this running. It's just such a wonderful asset. I know it grew out of, our pandemic days, and I'm so thrilled that it has continued to have this fantastic life and that you are all here to enjoy it with me. I'm thrilled to have the invitation from the Quilt Alliance to conduct this interview today. As Emma said, it is an interview for our podcast, Running Stitch, but it's also a wonderful opportunity for me to get to talk to a quilt maker that I really admire, and have you all here to feed me questions as well. And feel free to do that as we get going. As Emma said, easiest place is to put them in the Q&A. That's be sure I'll see them. So thank you for that introduction of me, and I will now introduce our guest, Libs Elliott. Elizabeth Elliott is a textile artist and designer who explores the intersection of technology and traditional craft by using generative design to build handmade quilts. A deep appreciation for craftsmanship, design history, and future-focused applications are all reflected in her work. She studied material art and design at Ontario College of Art and Design University, OCAD, and also received a BA in Cultural Studies from Trent University. Her commissions have included work for individuals as well as corporate clients, including Absolute Vodka. I definitely recommend looking up that great campaign. She has exhibited and presented about her work internationally as well, and she designs a fabric collection for Andover. She is joining us from, I believe you're joining us from Toronto. At least that's where I know you live and work. Thank you so much for being with us, Libs.
Hi, thanks for having me so much. I'm going to try not to pretend, I'm going to pretend I don't see how many participants are here right now. Like, whoa, that's fantastic. I'm excited to be here.
That's great. So as Emma introduced, our new season of Running Stitch, which I've been conducting interviews for this summer, is focusing on the intersection of quilts and technology. And as such, Libs is clearly the perfect guest because her work is all about that. At first consideration, one might think that quilts and technology are antithetical due to the nostalgic ways that we view quilts as pre-industrial salvage craft, that it's an old-timey thing. And I'm sure you all have friends who are shocked to learn that there's this whole living, thriving community of quilt makers today when everyone thinks it must be a dead art. But in this season, we want to break apart some of these notions and look at how integral various technologies have been to quilt making, from the sewing needle, the cotton sewing thread, factory-produced cloth, the internet, rotary cutters and computers. All of these technologies have made quilt making what it is today. And our interviewee, Libs, explores this relation in her work, navigating between digital and analog worlds as she designs quilts using a programming language. And I'll let her tell us much more about how that all works. QSOS, the oral history archive on which Running Stitch builds, is about living quilt makers. Yet, as Emma said, we've been doing this for 25 years now, and so that spans a lot of the quilt revival of the late 20th century, as well as into the 21st century now, with new technologies that are changing how we make quilts in all sorts of ways. As part of QSOS, we've had a regular question that asks, how have advances in technology influenced your work? And the answers to this, of course, have been very wide-ranging, particularly if you think back, like the first interviews we were conducting in the late 1990s, when the World Wide Web was in its infancy. So let's listen to one of these responses to just get a little bit of a taste of how this question often appears in one of our QSOS interviews. Emma, I'll have you play this clip.
Have advances in technology influenced your work?
Well, when I started in 1990, they'd already invented the rotary cutter and the rule, so in the mat, so I probably wouldn't have stayed with it if they hadn't done that. Advances, I don't know. I've taken a lot of classes from Nancy Pearson and Pat Campbell, and they've shown me how to use the tools that we have, you know, to my advantage. But other than that, I have an embroidery machine, a Genome, but I don't use it a lot.
And so you don't use a computer. You don't use a computer. I think they're, you know, asking.
Mine's all, I write it, I draw a pattern, and you wouldn't believe it, on a piece of notebook paper. I just scribble it out.
Oh.
Thanks, Emma, and hopefully the audio is coming through clearly to you. This is one of our technical challenges, of course, from hosting this Textile Talk, where we want to bring in the voices from the past as well as our voices today. So for Libs, technology not only influences her work, but it's really, her work is in large part what I would consider a meditation on technology, as she explores the relationship of computer-generated algorithms to handmade objects. As she has described her own work, quote, "It's the idea of transforming intangible strings of letters and numbers into something warm and luxurious that really appeals to me," end quote. And that's very appealing to me too, to see these worlds and various technologies, from the sewing thread to the computer algorithm, all coming together to create this fantastic work. So on that note, let's start the interview. Libs, welcome to Running Stitch and welcome to Textile Talks. Let's have you start off telling us about your design process.
Okay, thank you for having me. All right, so my process I started using a programming language in around 2012. And it's a programming language called Processing, which is an open source Java-based language. And you put in code, and the output on your screen is a visual. And so I started using it to randomly generate my quilt designs on screen. And initially, and for the most part, what I do is I draw up quilt blocks in Illustrator, and they're just blank blocks. And I put those into, I call them into my code. So the code will pull in the different blocks. It'll pull in the colors that I've chosen, which are the hex values, which are digital values. And I set parameters as far as how large I want the graph. Imagine it's like graph paper on your screen. And when I run the code, it takes all the parameters and rules that I've set, and it throws them up onto this grid on screen. And I never know exactly what I'm going to get. It's just taking the basic rules that I've given it and outputting within seconds a really interesting visual. And every time I run that code, it'll give me something completely different. So the algorithm is always changing and tweaking, and you'll never get the same image twice. So then from that point, I'll have an on-screen render, and then I take that render and I choose a section of it. Usually I work quite large, so I'll choose a section of it and decide, okay, I'll make this part into a quilt. And unfortunately, the coding language does not tell me how much fabric I need or the math around any of that. So I work all of that out, both on screen or just on paper by hand, write out my requirements to make the actual quilt. And then I'll go from there to cut and piece the quilt step by step.
So just to ask a couple follow-up questions about this process.
Right.
So we would see something like this quilt appearing on the screen as the rendering, and then, but it might even be larger, and then you're choosing, then the human, the artist, comes in and chooses which sections to use, right?
Yes, so which portion of that?
Right. And then you're almost, coming back to what our interview clip described at first, like back to the paper sometimes or do you print out templates that are based on this, or you kind of?
Well, I mean, when I first started, I didn't understand quilt math. It was a lot of calculating for me. So I was freezer paper piecing all of it. So I would print out to scale. And it's just, when you look at it now, I kind of laugh because it's just half square triangles for the most part. So now I know how to do the math, obviously. When I started, I didn't know. So it's freezer paper piecing. And then as I made more of these, I eventually invested in an AccuQuilt so that I could cut out all the sizes of the triangles I was using. But usually I will, no matter what, I will print out a digital version of the layout. And then I like to handwrite, make notes all over it. So I do have a stack of, even if I've sold these quilts, like this one is long gone somewhere on a journey, I still have the paper notes for all of it and how I made it. So yeah, so there is this little transition between the screen and then getting down to the sewing. So.
And just another, like when the algorithm spits out something, do you ever just reject it completely? And
yes, yeah, I reject a lot. I reject a lot of them until I get something interesting, or I see something right away that catches my eye, and then I will save it. So now I have folders with that, probably a few thousand renders. Some will become quilts someday, and I still go back to them. Like there are quilts from, this one I think is from 2013 or 2014. I'll still go back into those folders and re-look at what I did. And if something is still catching my eye, then I know that it needs to be realized into a physical quilt. So that's the challenge, is that the code, I'm working with this tool or collaborating with it in a way, and I can play really quickly and sketch really quickly, which is exciting for me. But then also the reality is only so many of these will actually become quilts. So
sure, you could generate more. I mean, it's like really an infinite amount of design.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes.
But you, for this, let's again use this quilt as an example. You've selected the color palette as these are the options, or using those hex codes and so forth. So your algorithm is not selecting from the vast and endless array of colors available. It's choosing from what you have kind of pre-selected.
Yes, correct. So I've taken specific colors and I've set those as rules in the code. And so often I will use another tool, online tool. There are a few of them now where you can take a photograph, upload that photograph, and drag little dots or points around to find out what the hex value of colors are. And there are a lot of free tools like that you can use online. And some of them even tell you what the closest, Kona or Andover solids color is, which is fantastic. So, those tools are advancing as well. So I can take those, put them into my code, and have an idea of what's going to happen on screen. But it's still totally random and always a surprise when I get a render.
That's really great. I'm seeing a few questions come in on the Q&A about being able to see what the computer screen or algorithm looks like. I don't know if that's going to be possible, Libs, but I'm just making sure you see that as well, in case when we take a break towards the end of our conversation, if you have something handy to pull up. and show. No big deal. We just trying to respond to the eager audience members who want to like understand this great kind of tricky experience. I'm next gonna kind of step back from this process and the computer code for a moment and ask how you first became interested in quilts and quilt making.
Well, I did study weaving and natural dyeing in college, but prior to that, like, unfortunately, I'm not someone, I love hearing stories about people who have learned from a relative and it's been passed down through the generations. And I'm not one of those people, but my dad was an antique dealer. And so on Friday nights, we would go, every Friday evening, we'd go to the auction barn so he could, buy antiques for the shop, and the shop was attached to our house. And we would walk in every Friday night, and every time there were quilts lining the barn on the inside, hanging up, being up for auction. And so as a child, I was very visually drawn to those. They were, really beautiful to see and curious to me. And then my dad would buy them. He had several collectors who he would purchase quilts for, and then he would have them in the shop, and we would use them too functionally. They were always on our beds, and he would use them as tablecloths, or not, but for special occasions, or drape them over an armoire in the shop. And so I had the opportunity to really get up close to antique quilts and get a real appreciation for the handwork that goes into them and just the history of them. So that was what initially drew me to quilting, but I've always been interested in textiles. So that's when, I was working as a project manager in my 30s, and I had no creative outlet. And then I took a class with Johanna Masco, and I got hooked right away. I knew it was for me. So.
And then how did you make the segue from, a new quilt maker, learning, appreciator of quilts, but learning the techniques, into this computer assisted design that you've kind of process that you've created?
Well, when I first started out, I was learning. I did learn. The first one the class I did was a sampler quilt, which was great because it was a really wonderful way to learn different techniques within one quilt and get a taste for all the different techniques that are used. And then within a couple years, I was making I'd made a few quilt patterns from other people, but everything to me was very repetitive, which is nice. I like symmetry and repetition, but I wanted to switch things up. And so I ended up making a quilt, drafting myself and making a quilt for a friend of mine who is a digital artist. And I had to draft it all on graph paper. It took a lot of brain power for me to make things not symmetrical and make them look scaled differently. They were all different plus signs. And when I gifted it to him, he was very appreciative. And he was his name is Joshua Davis, and he's a pretty big deal in the digital art world. And so when I gifted him this quilt, he started to look into quilting as like, ooh, look at these interesting geometric motifs. And he started to play with them in his code. And then I said, hey, it took a lot of work for me to make this one quilt for you. Is there a way we could collaborate, or you could show me and teach me how to use a programming language or something to help me sketch ideas quickly? So that's really how that started. And that was around 2012. So.
That's a really, really fascinating origin story. I'm going to address a couple of these questions that we have in the chat right now that are, while we're talking about the code, before we kind of move on to some other ideas. And some of these may be a little bit in the weeds. Why do you need to use or do you export it from Illustrator into another, or you're applying the code to the files that you have in Illustrator?
I'm saving little SVG files from Illustrator. So they're just little SVGs. They all sit in a folder. And so the code is calling those SVGs in from the other folder and then dropping them onto the grid. So, so I don't have to connect it to Illustrator at all. Illustrator is just where I draw the blocks. And then I save them into this one asset folder, and the code knows to go there to pull the assets.
Very cool. We've had a couple questions about the quilt that's behind you on the in your background. Are such curves also something that you've trained your algorithm to create for you?
Yes, so those are additional blocks that I draw up and see what happens. It's funny, if you do look at some of these images, early on, I was just doing triangles. Like that was hard enough for me to, to do. And then eventually I started to put curves in there. And I think one of the first projects, you do have an image here, so we'll get to it at some point, but I started to put, I was like, maybe I could try sewing a curve. And so I put that in there, and it really changes the way the quilts look. And you can see the one behind me has quite a few curves in it and orange peels. And yeah, this is it here. So it really does change the dynamic of how that quilt flows visually. And if you do end up looking up that Absolute Vodka campaign that I did a quilt for Canada, Absolute Canada, you'll see there are similar blocks. So I put curves into that one as well. So
that's super. Another question is about the use of, it looks like mostly you use solid colored fabrics, or do you use printed fabrics?
When I first started out, I was using just solids. And I was doing a lot of commissions for people. Not surprisingly, it was I was getting commissions from programmers. Or programmers whose grandmothers had given them a quilt and they really loved them, but they were really intrigued by the fact that I was using programming to make quilts. So yeah.
So mostly solid colored fabrics.
Mostly solids, sure. But now that I design fabrics for Andover, okay. I do use more prints. I find that it's like an added level of challenge, right? How do you get prints to work well? And they do later quilts that I've made with prints. I mean, they also look amazing. And I did one with Liberty Fabrics years ago. And I love that they have this beautiful traditional florals with so much history, but in this wild sort of modern way. There was a really beautiful dynamic happening in that quilt. So I do like to mix it up.
The fabrics that you design for Andover, I mean, it sounds like it's a mix of printed fabrics and solids. Do you then similarly, use computer design as part of that process as well?
Yeah, I do. So I use processing as well for some prints. So not every collection has one, but in a lot of my first collections with Andover, and even like the one that just came out, Rancho Relaxo, it's got a few prints in there where I've used the program to help me generate an interesting pattern, because sometimes a pattern will come out and I'll look at it and I'll think, that's really beautiful. I could never make that into a quilt, but it could be a really interesting surface design pattern. So yeah, I tend to use it for both.
I love that. It's sort of a meta, like layers of design involved here. And I have one question here about the randomization of the color. That is the same processing language that's randomizing the color as well? Yes,
so it's randomizing everything. It randomizes the color for me, and I can also weight the colors. So if there's a color that I like more than the others, or like this is the very first one I ever did with processing code that's on screen right now. So with this one, there's more white than any other color, and so I'd set it up so that the code knows to use white twice as much as the other colors, so I can set some of those parameters. I still don't know how it's going to end up looking, but I can weight colors, and I can also rotate the blocks or flip the blocks. I can tell the code, take all these blocks and rotate them 90 degrees, 3 ways. Yeah, so there are all kinds of little tweaks that I can make.
Okay. And then are you a machine piecer, I assume?
Yes, I do some EPP. I'm not very fast. Okay. I'm not very quick, and I've made some patterns, quilt patterns that I sell using the code, but then they're EPP kits, and so that's a really interesting going from using, doing something digitally and breaking it right down to, and now you have to stitch it all by hand, and I do love hand stitching. I'm just slow.
There's so much to love about this, that you're taking this very 21st century design process and using, an 18th and 19th century method. That's really great. English paper piecing is the EPP. Yes, always call us out for our jargon, please. Another question about your technique is the quilting. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. The quilting, I usually do machine quilting. I don't do too much hand quilting. I've done a few. Again, I'm kind of slow. So most of my quilts are machine quilted. I like, because there's so much going on in a lot of these quilts already visually, I tend to keep the quilting fairly simple, straight line, or I will send it out to a long armor to have custom quilting done, because I do really love that aspect of collaborating. Again, another layer of collaboration and giving someone else who has an entirely different skill set creatively than I have to add their own quilting on top. So there are times when I do send quilts out for quilting.
Have you considered a way to integrate the computer code into creating quilting designs?
I was thinking of that today in the shower. Yes,
right.
I would love to have a computerized long arm. It's just not in my budget, but if someone wants to sponsor me, I'd be happy to, because I would love to. I do think it would be amazing to take processing and generative art and be able to stitch it on and see what happens that way. So it's something I do think about, but it's like buying another car. So.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and you need another garage as well, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me make sure I'm not missing any other questions here. Let's take a step back. This is a good question for us to sort of, this is a very technical subject. So we want to make sure when we're talking about EPP or we're talking about code, that everyone understands what we're talking about. Can you tell us what you mean by the word code and in this context? Can you explain what code is?
Oh my gosh, you're asking a non-technical person. Well, code, there are different languages, right, that are written in programming languages and coding languages, same thing-ish, I guess. But code is, when you open a pretty app on your phone to do something, code is running behind the scenes of that. Or when you're looking at a website, websites are usually built with, or they used to be built with HTML, which is a type of language, right? So the code I use is processing, and it's a language, and it's not very exciting to look at. I can do a little quick demo at the end if we have time, but the code itself is really just strings of information. And the goal of those strings of information is to give you an output or a result. So I hope I explained that well, because again, I am not super technical, so surprisingly.
Yeah, I think that was a good answer. I mean, it is, all of this stuff. I mean, participating here today by Zoom, we're all benefiting from code. Whether we can all read it and understand it is a different question, of course.
Exactly.
This really segues in nicely to the question of artificial intelligence, which is clearly a huge buzzword in the last year. And we already have a question about a new technology, asking if you've tried some of the AI to create a pattern. And I also had a question along those same lines, like what you imagine is possible with some of the AI tools, whether it's promise or peril.
Oh, goodness. To be honest, I haven't delved too deep into AI yet. I have issues with the open AI and how it can just scrape for things and use other people's artwork. So I'm a little hesitant about that, but there are ways in which it can make things, and it will make things a little easier. But again, I guess it's like with any new technology where there are risks and there are benefits, right? So I've used AI as far as helping me to write a piece of copy for a blog post or a newsletter. And in that sense, it can be really helpful, but you still have to go back in and use your own skills to really finesse it and clean it up, because it still pulls all kinds of weird things. I could see AI in the future being helpful for, like, I'm using a programming language. I have to know how to use the programming language to get a result. I could see how maybe AI would simplify that process, in that you're just inputting like red, squares, triangles, large, and then I don't know. And then you run it and then you get some sort of result for a quilt design. Or maybe you could eventually use it to help you write quilt patterns for production. So it's like this huge unknown still for me that I think is both exciting but also scary, right? Like, is it going to, could you put in eventually with AI, could somebody write, I want to make that quilt that person sells that pattern for, how do I do it? And then the AI just tells you, and then that pattern designer loses out on the right. I'm always thinking from making a living perspective too. Like, I don't want to take away from writers who are so important. So I might use AI a little bit for a newsletter, but I would love to hire a real person to write that newsletter. So yeah.
Yeah, I think you've hit on a lot of the current tensions. I mean, that we're probably collectively feeling about AI to one degree or another. I mean, it's really unknown, and certainly, like, we're at this point where, it's your intellectual property of these designs, even though you're already using an assistive technology and creating them, it's still your generative work, rather than scraping everything that's been posted out there in the world to see what comes up with it. Along these lines, have you considered selling your code, or how do you? I want to even rephrase this a little bit. Like, I know you teach some and are involved in some community sewing and quilt making. Is this something that you've been able to teach and impart and share, or because of the technical limitations or challenges, is that something that you haven't pursued?
I don't sell my code, partly because it gives me quilts. It gives me results that look like my quilts, and that's my aesthetic, and that's partly how I make a living, right? And partly how I express myself. So I don't sell the code to anyone. There are other programs out there that will, help you make a quilt design quickly and digitally. But I do teach a class called Embrace the Chaos. Once in a while, I teach this workshop to guilds or individuals, and it uses we use rules. We set up some rules, but we don't have to use computers. So literally, I have like this fancy little bag, and in this bag there are bingo chips and dice, and we roll and pull bingo chips, and that helps us to quickly plop down the blocks that we've chosen on grids, and everybody designs a different quilt. So it's really, I'm following those rules of an algorithm where you set up, parameters, but you don't have to use a computer.
Right, I love this. I mean, in my world of work, I work in digital humanities. We talk about the no tech, the low tech, and the high tech. And bingo chips, they're a low tech. I mean, but that's still technology, right?
Absolutely.
So along those lines, what are some of the other ways that technology advances, whether they are from the sort of analog era or the digital era? In what ways has technology influenced your work, aside from the obvious processing and coding aspect?
Well, I would say the second, in addition to just creating my whole look and aesthetic and being able to express myself in that way, a technology, social media changed everything for me. Started being able to share my work, and then that's how I first connected. Listen, when I first started quilting, I didn't know there were guilds. I didn't know guilds were a thing. It's horrible and embarrassing, but I didn't know. And then once I got onto Instagram and Facebook, there are these whole worlds of these other people out there who are doing what I do. And so it was this incredible way to connect with people and be able to start going out and teaching and sharing my work, being inspired by what other people are doing. and just connecting globally. Even now, we're connecting via Zoom from all over the world. And that's really changed, I think, how we work, and just it's made our community feel so much bigger than when I first started out, and I was doing it sort of in this silo and not really aware of who was around me. So
just a logistics question, do you lecture or teach in the United States as well as Canada?
I do. I'll go anywhere.
And do you teach remotely or in person, or
Both.
okay,
Remotely and in
great.
person. And then also I just actually last week I kicked off a new online community called the So Squad. And in the So Squad, we have monthly workshops, and I lead monthly Chaos Club, where we do little randomized activities to kickstart our creativity. So that's a whole new community-based website, and it's great. Already we have members from Europe and Australia and the States and Canada, and so it's been a really wonderful way to
This
connect.
stuff would never be possible
No.
without, yeah, totally. And Amy Mellon has put in links to how to book classes with Libs. So if you want to share that with your guilds or other groups, you can find out, and also how to join the So Squad. Thanks, Amy, for that. I want to pull in an excerpt from one of our archival oral history interviews now. So I'm just going to give Emma a minute to get that queued up. As part of Running Stitch, we like to listen back to older interviews and kind of make connections between our contemporary conversations as well. And I really love this question, sort of connecting contemporary quilt making to this long legacy of quilt making we have. And we've already kind of hit on this, like Libs, who uses an algorithm, a computer generated algorithm, also uses English paper piecing. And we also, you know, see the half square triangle. This is the same half square triangle that we've been using for centuries to make quilts with. So let's listen, without further introduction, commentary by me to this clip from Rachel Clark. This is one of our early interviews from 1999.
Do you get any kind of bond with either women in the past or contemporary women who are quilt makers through your quilt making?
Do I have a bond, or do I sense a bond with them? I think no more than that. I think it's wonderful to be part of a continuum, that that a sense of connection, that there were women in the past and there will be women in the future that will be doing this, and that the thing that I think is so amazing about it is the fact that we think we're so contemporary. And you can look at some of those old quilts and the fabric, or the colors that they put together, is so today. And so, you know, you kind of think, well, gosh, they must have been on the cutting edge with, but some of those the things that some of those women work with. And then I think the other thing that, and I don't know if so much as a bond with that, because we're so in, but the admiration that I feel that some of the most amazing quilts that those women made, and they made them with brown paper and a pencil or newspaper. They didn't have rotary cutters. They didn't have templates, the kind of stuff that have been laser cut. They didn't have all of this stuff that we have, and they made quilts that just blow some of our stuff right out of the water. And I mean, I think that's the thing that I find that is so amazing. And so a lot of those quilt makers.
Thank you, Emma. So I want to pose this question to you, and you can also react in any way to this clip, Libs. But how do you see your relationship as a 21st century quilt maker to this long legacy that we have?
Oof. I would have this very similar sentiments, and that's, 20 or 30 years on from that interview, in that I may be using very different tools and technologies But you can see I'm still using the half square triangle. I'm still using those very traditional blocks because they have staying power, right? And my goal is still the same, I think, as quilters who came before me, in that I want to leave my mark. And that's like a physical mark with stitches and physical textiles. And I want to leave my mark and put my energy into my quilts just the way quilters before me did with theirs. So I'm a big believer in that our quilts that we make hold energy and hold our energy that we put into them. And then when we send them off on their journeys, they continue to collect energy of those who use them, no matter how it's used. And so I really love that idea of being part of this long string of this beautiful craft that's been around for so long. And I really do have a lot to thank for those people who came before us with. Honestly, I do. Again, it is like being in awe of what they used versus what I use. It's pretty mind-blowing to see what they were able to accomplish. Yeah, and then second to that, I would also add that, you know, even though we use technologies, there's this false promise that technology is going to make everything easier, right? And it doesn't. Or I mean, in some ways it does, but in some ways it doesn't. So the programming, like saying, well, we have to, you know, you just use a computer and it's just so much easier than it used to be. That's true, but there's still this ramp up in knowledge and skill that you need to have in order to be able to use those new technologies. So that's a whole new, I do appreciate all the work that people put into learning how to use a computerized machine. Goodness knows, there are still many things on my beautiful FOF that I don't know how to do yet because I haven't looked at the tutorial or, you know, yeah, so there's still skill required in leveraging those new technologies to make quilts.
That's interesting. One of the other interviews I was conducting for Running Stitch this season is with a historian, Rachel Maines, who has written a lot about the Industrial Revolution and its effect on needlework, on home needlework in particular. And she brought up a book that I was familiar with that the title says it all, More Work for Mother, which is about how as we advance with new technologies, in some ways it creates, well, different work, but new work as well. So yes, there's an efficiency involved in this pattern generation, but then it also involves a certain amount of additional labor. I guess, yeah, in our 21st century world, we're certainly not making quilts because we are dependent on them as bed covers, but it's still a similar process. It's like, yes, there are efficiencies in using code, but also just like when you use ChatGPT to draft your newsletter or your blog post, you still as a human need to like come back in, and that
Absolutely.
The human touch is still going to be required, and I hope we don't lose that personally.
Yeah.
We've got a couple additional questions here. One about the use of scraps. So this is from Dina Newbert. In her lecture, she stresses that quilters should have a plan for their scraps. Does your process of designing these blocks using codes factor in scraps in any way?
Ooh, well, I try to maximize my fabric, just like any quilter. I try to maximize that fabric as much as possible because I don't like waste. And then if there are scraps left over, then I can make smaller pieces with them or utilize those scraps in like creative activities to kickstart something larger. So I am getting more into that work because I do have a few bins full of scraps where I think, okay, how can I use these and not let them go to waste? So I do think it's really important. And with something like this quilt here, I used an AccuQuilt die cutter, but still prior to like putting it through the cutter, I'm cutting down my fabric as much as I can so I can get as many triangles out of those pieces of fabric as possible and not have waste. So.
Right. Well, do keep adding your questions to the Q&A if you have additional ones as we spend our last few moments together here. I don't know if is it possible for you to show us a screenshot of some of the, or share your screen to show any of your algorithms so people have a sense of.
Yeah, I just want to make sure it's running, it's working.
Yeah, take your time. I'm happy to riff here for a minute.
I think as long as I'm a co-host, I can share my screen.
Great.
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Okay. All right. Can everybody see this? It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't look very exciting unless you are a programmer of some sort, then you might be excited about seeing this, this code. So this is the framework. This is, it's written in processing, and this is the piece of code that I use to generate some of my designs. And so within the code, I'm setting up a grid, right? So I'm defining how large, how many squares I want across and down in my grid. And then I'm choosing a color for the background. I always have a background color, and that may end up changing, but right now I've got one color turned on for the background. And then down here, these are all different sets of color palettes that I've used and played around with in previous quilts. So they're all grayed out and turned off, but I've got one color palette turned on. And because I just opened this up, I don't know what we're going to get. So that's kind of exciting. So this color is the color palette of colors that I've probably pulled from a photograph or just from something on Pinterest where I really loved the colors. And so I've defined those using hex values. And then I've weighted the colors here. So some of them will be used twice or 3 times as much as other colors. And then down here is where I'm telling the code to take these specific drawings, the little blocks that I've drawn in Illustrator that are sitting in a folder. And I'm saying, take this double parallelogram and a flying goose and an HST, take all these ones I have turned on, all the ones turned off will not show up, and put them on the grid and fill them with the colors. And also down here, rotate them, rotate those blocks around at 90 degrees in 4 different ways. And for now, we're just scaling them all the same. So all those blocks are going to show up on the same size. So I'm running this, which means I'm pressing play, basically. And that's the result. Boom, within seconds. Oh, and there's a curve in it.
Oh my God, that was so fantastic to watch in real time. And then, you would then look at this and then decide, yeah, is this one going in the trash bin, or is there a section of it? Or...
And if I close this, I'll never get that one again. I'll run it again, and I will get something with all the same parameters, no real changes, but it's not identical to the last one.
Amazing. I love this. And I can see that everyone in the chat also thinks this is incredibly cool.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for whipping out that demo on short notice. Really, really cool. I'm sure there may be some additional questions in the Q&A. Feel free to add them, or just add your shared awe with me. There's a question about how long it takes to create that code. Now, just seeing it on the screen, we could see it's a whole string of data, although it looks like you're reusing things from past.
Yes, so I'll have folders for specific projects, and I can reuse a lot of that code, or I can copy, paste, and then just change the parameters and the rules within the code. I also have other pieces of code that use hexagons and create hexagonal based layouts. Also one with just an outline if I'm doing something for surface design. So I have a few different pieces of code that I play with.
Yeah, I was wondering about that, because the code of some of the quilts we first saw in the slideshow, as well as what your process you're describing, is very grid oriented.
Yeah.
And so you can create different kinds of grids or frameworks.
Yes. Yeah. And I can do different kinds of overlaps, and ultimately processing is being used since about 2019, 2020. There are a lot of people who've become digital artists and they're creating generative artworks and selling them as NFTs. That's a whole other discussion, but a lot of them are using processing. And Joshua Davis, who taught me how to use it, he uses it and does, incredible animated. So it also has capabilities for animating and reacting to sound. So he does these, like, I think he did Taylor Swift's Super Bowl show a few years ago, and he did the projections using this language. So it's got a ton of capability in it that's outside of my quilting world. I just use it for this one thing. So.
And like that code that we could see on the screen in your text editor there, how long did it take you to learn that and generate that, all of that kind of text, the code?
That only took a little while because Josh helped me write it and then he taught me how to use it. So it only took a while, but it's funny. I enjoy those types of challenges. It's just like with quilting, where there's a lot of math in quilting, and math never came naturally to me, but I do love the challenge of it. So sitting down and having to learn how to do that was challenging, but rewarding. So it didn't take too long to get up and running. So.
We have a question again. The quilt that's behind you, that was in fact a pattern generated by code, correct?
Yeah.
Right. And so, but there's also a clarifying question. Does your code put this into the block, like the smaller unit, when you are moving it into the actual tangible crafting part of the process?
I don't.
Or how do you get it, the block rather than the whole?
Like the block itself? I have to do all of that manually. So once I have a render like the ones I showed that popped up on screen, I have to make those decisions. How big do I want this to be? How big are those blocks? Usually I work in 6 or 8 inch size blocks. So I'll do the math for those. Yeah, something like this. I think these were all 6 inch blocks. And so I had to figure that out, how to the math around each block and how much fabric roughly I would need to make it. So the code just gives me the image, and then I have to work from there to figure out all the specs around the quilting.
Fantastic. Well, this, as you can see from the enthusiastic responses, and I'm hoping you're catching a lot of the oohs and amazings as well. Libs, people are really fascinated with your design process, and it's so wonderful to see the resulting quilts, which are just, even if we knew nothing else about how you made these quilts, they would just be gorgeous objects. And the depth, now that we do know the process, is just astounding. On behalf of all of our audience, I want to thank you, Libs Elliott, for joining us today for Textile Talks, but also for this future episode of Running Stitch. Do be sure to subscribe. I'm really excited about this new season that will be coming out in the coming months. I already have some really great interviews in the can, and Emma and I will be editing those into the episodes for this season that will be coming out. But in the meantime, please do go back and listen to the previous seasons. We've got lots of great episodes out there from the past as you await this new season focused on technology. And Libs, I can't wait to share this with the rest of our listeners as well. It'd be really fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed sharing my process and my quilts with everyone. And I look forward to seeing people on the internet and in real life too.
Yeah, join the Sew Squad. That sounds really fun.
That's where I am. Yeah.
So you can find Libs at libselliott.com and at Libs Elliott. We've shared the links in the chat, and you can find Janneken at jannekensmucker.org. That's not your web address. I'm sorry.
I'm more like Beyonce. You don't need a last name for me.
Just Janneken. And you can find the Quilt Alliance at quiltalliance.org. So I hope you'll visit and join. And thank you so much for joining us. And thanks again, Libs. That was really, I'm starting to think a lot about random chance, maybe in a more low-tech, like bingo chip kind of way. But
dice are the way to go, or a paper bag.
I love that.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you
cool.
for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to you all for joining us.